Dead America, The Soldier, The Day After, Part 8, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Flint closed the distance silently, his boots finding the gaps between the broken glass on the floor as he moved down the aisle behind the two men. They were focused on the back of the store, their rifles raised as they crept toward the counter where Davis and Mandy had taken cover. The lead man was broad across the shoulders, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. The one behind him was thinner, younger, moving with the nervous energy of someone who had never pointed a rifle at another person before. Both of them had their attention locked forward, completely unaware that the sergeant was 3 yards behind them and closing. Flint glanced past the men toward the back of the store, catching the faintest movement behind the counter. Davis had shifted his position, and Flint could see the captain's eyes in the dim light, watching the approaching men and waiting for Flint to make his move. Flint gave a barely perceptible nod toward the rear exit, a metal door with a push bar that he could just make out past the counter. Davis understood the signal. When the moment came, he would get Mandy out the back while Flint handled the two men up front. The thin man in the rear paused, tilting his head as if he heard something. Flint didn't give him a chance to turn around. He surged forward, wrapping his arm around the man's neck and dragging him backward. The rifle clattered to the floor as the man's hands instinctively went to the arm, crushing his windpipe. The commotion spun the lead man around, his eyes going wide as he saw his partner being choked out by a soldier who had materialized from the darkness behind them. He swung his rifle toward Flint, but the sergeant was already moving, using the thin man as a shield between them. "Drop it!" the lead man yelled, his voice cracking as he tried to find an angle with his rifle. Flint didn't respond. He tightened his grip, and the thin man went limp, slumping unconscious in his arms. Flint let the dead weight drop to the floor and stepped over the body, putting himself between the lead man and the aisle behind him. At the back of the store, Flint heard the push bar on the rear exit click, followed by the brief scrape of the door swinging open and closed. Davis had gotten Mandy out. That left just him and the man with the rifle. The lead man took a step backward, keeping the weapon trained on Flint's chest. His hands were steadier than his partner's had been, but his breathing was fast and shallow, his nostrils flaring with each exhale. "You don't want to do this," Flint said, keeping his voice low and even. "Shut your mouth," the man replied. "You people come into our town, snatch folks out of their homes, and you think you can tell me what I want? I'm not telling you anything. I'm giving you a chance to walk out of here." "I've got the gun pointed at you, soldier. I'd say I'm the one giving chances." Flint watched the man's trigger finger. It was resting along the side of the receiver rather than on the trigger itself. The man was angry, but he wasn't ready to kill, not yet. "Your friend is still breathing," Flint said, nodding toward the unconscious man on the floor. "You can pick him up and walk out that front window, and this is over." The man's eyes flicked down to his partner for just a second. That was all the time Flint needed. He closed the gap in 2 fast strides, grabbing the barrel of the rifle with his left hand and shoving it toward the ceiling. The man pulled the trigger reflexively, and the shot punched through a ceiling tile, raining dust and debris down on both of them. Flint ripped the rifle out of the man's grip and sent it skidding down the aisle with a hard toss. The man recovered faster than Flint expected, throwing a solid right hook that caught the sergeant on the jaw and snapped his head to the side. The punch had real weight behind it, catching him off guard. Flint absorbed the blow and came back with a straight jab that caught the man square on the nose. Cartilage crunched under his knuckles, and blood began pouring down the man's face. The man staggered, but didn't go down, swinging wildly with both fists as he tried to create distance. The two of them crashed into a shelf of paint cans, sending a cascade of metal containers tumbling to the floor. The cans rolled in every direction, the lids popping off a few of them and splattering white and beige across the tile. Flint slipped on the paint, losing his footing for a moment, the man using the opportunity to tackle him into the opposite shelf. The impact drove the air from Flint's lungs as the metal shelving dug into his back. The man pressed his forearm against Flint's throat, pinning him against the shelf while reaching down toward his belt with his other hand. The glint of a blade caught the ambient light as the man pulled a hunting knife from a leather sheath on his hip. Flint saw the knife come up and reacted on instinct. He drove his elbow into the man's midsection, doubling him over just enough to break the chokehold. As the man stumbled forward, Flint pulled the cleaver from his belt and brought it down in a short, controlled arc. The blade caught the man's knife hand at the wrist, and the hunting knife clattered to the floor, along with a spray of blood. The man let out a howl of pain, clutching his wounded arm against his chest as he staggered backward into the paint-covered aisle. Flint kicked the hunting knife away and raised the cleaver, positioning himself between the injured man and any path of retreat. Blood was dripping from the man's wrist onto the floor, mixing with the spilled paint in dark swirls. "It's done," Flint said. "Stay down." The man sank to one knee, his face twisted in pain as he pressed his good hand over the wound. His flannel shirt was already soaking through with blood, and his skin was going pale. The fight had gone out of him. "You son of a bitch!" the man spat through gritted teeth. Movement from the front of the store pulled Flint's attention. Two more men were climbing through the broken window, drawn inside by the sound of the gunshot and the shouting. One of them had a shotgun, the other a handgun, and both of them locked onto Flint as soon as they cleared the sill. Flint stepped backward, putting himself behind the end of an aisle to break their line of sight. The situation had just gotten a lot worse. "Cody, you all right?" the man with the shotgun called out. "He cut me!" the injured man yelled back, his voice strained. "He cut my damn hand!" The two newcomers began moving into the store, splitting up to approach from different aisles. Flint could hear their footsteps on the glass and debris, one set coming down the left side and the other down the right. They were trying to flank him. Flint backed deeper into the store, his mind working through options that were getting thinner by the second. His cleaver was effective in close quarters, but going up against a shotgun and a handgun with a blade was a fast way to end up dead. Then a voice cut through the store, loud and sharp enough to freeze everyone in place. "That is enough!" Mandy stepped out from behind the counter at the back of the store, holding the rifle that the thin man had dropped on the floor when Flint choked him out. She had it leveled at the man with the shotgun, her stance wide and her arms locked straight in front of her. "Mandy, what the hell are you doing?" the man with the shotgun asked, clearly recognizing her. "I'm trying to stop you idiots from getting yourselves killed, Dale," Mandy replied. She squeezed the trigger, sending a round into the ceiling above Dale's head. Chunks of tile and dust rained down on him, and he flinched hard, nearly dropping the shotgun. The man with the handgun stumbled backward, throwing his free hand up to shield his face from the debris. "Have I got your attention?" Mandy asked, her voice cutting through the ringing echo of the shot. "Are you out of your mind?" Dale sputtered, brushing dust from his shoulders. "These soldiers are the ones causing all this," he continued once he steadied himself, his shotgun still pointed in Flint's direction. "Christopher said they brought something into town, some kind of weapon or disease. They're the reason people are getting sick." "Christopher doesn't know what he's talking about," Mandy fired back. "I've been with these soldiers for the last few hours, and I've seen those things out there tear people apart. The military didn't cause this. They came here to help, and you all started shooting at them before they could explain." "That's not what we heard," Dale said. "I don't care what you heard. I'm telling you what I saw with my own eyes," Mandy said. "Those creatures killed 3 of your buddies on the street tonight. I watched it happen from the grocery store monitors. They didn't care that those men had guns. They didn't care about anything except ripping them apart. Is that what the soldiers brought? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like it was already here." Dale stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was chewing on something bitter. Then he shook his head and spat on the floor. "I don't give a damn what you think you saw. Christopher knows what's going on, and he told us what to do. Now put the gun down before you hurt yourself, girl." Mandy's expression hardened. She shifted her aim downward and pulled the trigger. The round punched through Dale's thigh, and he crumpled to the floor, the shotgun clattering away from him as both hands went to his leg. He let out a string of curses that echoed through the store, rolling onto his side as blood began seeping between his fingers. The man with the handgun raised his weapon toward Mandy, but Flint stepped out from behind the aisle with the cleaver in plain view, positioning himself where the man could see him clearly. The man looked from Flint to Mandy and back again, his hand shaking as he weighed his options. "Don't," Flint said. The man slowly lowered the handgun and tucked it into his waistband, raising his palms in surrender. "Now I'm going to walk out of here with this soldier, and you're not going to follow us," Mandy said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Get Dale patched up, get Cody on his feet, and go home. And tell Christopher that if he wants to know what's really going on, he can come talk to me instead of sending armed men after people trying to help." The man didn't argue. He moved to Dale's side, pulling off his belt to fashion a tourniquet around the wounded man's thigh. The unconscious man on the floor was starting to stir, groaning as he rolled onto his side. Between the three of them, they managed to get Dale upright, his arms draped over the shoulders of the other two as they limped toward the front window. After some awkward maneuvering, all four of them were out of the store. Flint let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at Mandy, who was still standing with the rifle raised, her arms trembling now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. She lowered the weapon slowly, as if setting it down too fast might shatter the fragile standoff she had just created. "I thought the captain got you out of here," Flint said. "He did," Mandy replied. "I came back." "Why?" "Because I figured you could use the help," she said, a slight edge to her voice that suggested arguing the point would be a waste of time. Flint let it go. He pulled his radio from his belt and clicked the transmit button. "Captain, you there?" Flint asked. The radio crackled before Davis's voice came through. "I'm here. I linked up with Morris and the others. What's your status?" "Store is clear. Mandy talked them down. They're pulling out," Flint reported. "Good. We've got a few more of Christopher's people probing the alley, but we can keep them busy from here," Davis said. "I need you and Mandy to get to the school. You're closer than we are, and we're running out of time." "Copy that. We'll find a way there," Flint said. "Watch your back, Sergeant. If they ambushed us once, they'll do it again." "Understood." Flint out. He clipped the radio back to his belt and turned to Mandy, who had set the rifle down on the counter and was rubbing the tension from her hands. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "You heard the man?" Flint said. "You still up for this?" Mandy picked the rifle back up and held it against her chest, giving him a single firm nod. "Let's go," she said. Flint moved to the rear exit and pushed the door open, checking the alley in both directions before stepping out into the night with Mandy close behind him. Chapter 2. Flint and Mandy moved through the alleys behind the downtown strip, cutting between buildings and across back lots to avoid the main roads. The sounds of truck engines faded behind them as Christopher's men regrouped near the hardware store, giving the two of them a narrow window to put some distance between themselves and the ambush site. Mandy led the way, navigating the back streets with the confidence of someone who had walked them 1,000 times. She cut through a gap in a wooden fence, crossed a darkened church parking lot, and ducked under a low-hanging branch that Flint barely spotted, in time to avoid catching across the face. "How much further?" Flint asked, as they paused at the edge of a residential street, scanning both directions before crossing. 4 blocks straight ahead," Mandy replied. "Once we cross this next street, we'll be able to see it." They crossed quickly, staying low, as they passed between 2 houses and into another backyard. A motion-activated floodlight clicked on as they stepped onto the patio, bathing them in white light. Flint cursed under his breath and picked up his pace, pulling Mandy through the yard and out the side gate before anything in the area had time to take notice. The next block brought them to the edge of a wide street that ran east to west across the residential area. Mandy held up her hand and pointed to the left. "There it is," she said. Flint followed her gaze and got his first look at the high school. The building was a large 2-story brick structure that sat on a slight rise, with a chain-link fence running the length of the property along the street. A football field was visible behind the main building, its goalposts standing like skeletal sentries against the night sky. The marquee sign out front still displayed a message congratulating the band on their competition placement, the letters slightly crooked from being arranged by hand. What caught Flint's attention was not the building itself, but what surrounded it. Pickup trucks and cars were parked bumper to bumper along the fence line, forming a makeshift barricade that stretched across the entire front of the property. Behind the vehicles, several dozen people stood watch with rifles, shotguns, and whatever else they had been able to get their hands on. Some of them had positioned themselves on the hoods and roofs of the trucks for a better vantage point. Others paced back and forth along the perimeter, their silhouettes backlit by the glow from the school's exterior lights. "They turned it into a fortress," Flint said. "Can you blame them?" Mandy replied. Flint studied the setup, counting heads and assessing positions out of habit. He estimated at least 40 people on the perimeter, though there were likely more inside or covering the other sides of the building. The vehicle barricade was smart, if unrefined. It would slow down the creatures and funnel them into gaps where the armed defenders could concentrate their fire. As he continued his assessment, a pair of headlights appeared from the west, moving fast along the street toward the school. Flint instinctively pulled Mandy behind a large oak tree at the corner of the nearest yard, pressing them both flat against the trunk as the vehicle approached. It wasn't one of Christopher's trucks. An ambulance rolled up to the front of the school, its lights flashing, but its siren off. The vehicle slowed as it reached the barricade, and several of the armed townspeople moved a pair of trucks apart to create a gap wide enough for the ambulance to pass through. The ambulance pulled up to the front entrance of the school, and 2 paramedics jumped out, rushing around to the rear doors and pulling a stretcher from the back. They wheeled it through the front doors with the urgency of people who knew they were running out of time. Before the doors swung shut, Flint caught a glimpse of the person on the stretcher. They were convulsing, their body arching against the restraining straps as the paramedics pushed them inside. "That person is sick," Flint said, his voice flat. "Looks like it," Mandy replied. "No, you're not hearing me. That person is sick the way the people who turn into those creatures get sick, and they just wheeled them into a building full of civilians." Mandy's face went pale as the implication registered. She looked from Flint to the school and back again, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "How long do they have?" she asked. "From what I've been told, 72 hours from when they first get sick. But from the looks of it, they've already turned." "And if there are more sick people inside," Mandy pressed. "Then that building is a ticking time bomb," Flint said. "Every person in there with A-type blood is going to turn, and nobody inside has any idea what's coming." Mandy stared at the school, her expression shifting from fear to resolve. She gripped the rifle tighter against her chest and stepped out from behind the tree. "We have to get in there," she said. "I know," Flint replied, "but I can't just walk up to that fence line with a rifle and a cleaver and expect them to hear me out. You saw how the last group reacted. So what do you want to do?" Flint let out a long exhale, running through the options in his head. There were no good ones. Every approach carried the risk of getting shot before he could open his mouth. But the alternative was standing here and watching while the people inside the school sat unknowingly beside ticking time bombs in human form. "You take me up there," Flint said. "You introduce me as someone who knows what's happening and can help. I'll put my weapons down before we get to the fence." "And if they don't listen?" Mandy asked. "Then I'll deal with that when it happens. But we don't have time to come up with something better." Mandy studied his face for a moment, searching for any sign of hesitation. She found none. She gave him a short nod and started walking toward the school, Flint falling into step beside her. They crossed the street and approached the barricade from the east side, staying visible and moving at a steady pace. Flint kept his hands away from his weapons, though he didn't disarm just yet. He wanted to wait until they were close enough to be heard before making himself vulnerable. One of the sentries on the perimeter spotted them when they were about 50 yards out. The man raised his rifle and called out to the others, and within seconds a half-dozen weapons were pointed in their direction. Flashlight beams stabbed through the darkness, locking onto the 2 figures approaching along the sidewalk. "That's far enough," a voice called out from behind the truck line. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Mandy stepped forward, raising one hand while keeping the rifle pointed at the ground with the other. "It's Mandy Reeves. I work at the grocery store on the east side," she called back. "I need to talk to whoever's in charge." There was a pause, followed by muffled conversation among the defenders. A couple of the flashlight beams shifted from Flint to Mandy as the townspeople recognized her. The tension dropped a fraction, but the weapons stayed up. "Who's that with you?" the voice demanded. "He's a soldier, and before you start shooting, he's here to help," Mandy replied. "He knows what's making people sick, and you need to hear what he has to say." "We don't need help from the military," another voice called out, this one sharper and more hostile. "They're the ones who caused this." Mandy turned to Flint, giving him a look that said this was his cue. Flint nodded and slowly reached for the sling on his rifle. He lifted it over his head and held the weapon out to his side at arm's length, then bent down and placed it on the sidewalk. He pulled the cleaver from his belt and set it beside the rifle, then straightened up and raised both hands. "My name is Sergeant Flint," he called out. "I'm unarmed and I'm asking for 5 minutes of your time. There are people inside that school who are going to die tonight if you don't let me help." More murmuring from behind the barricade. Flashlights swept over his disarmed figure as the defenders assessed him. The tension hung in the air like a held breath. Every set of eyes on the perimeter fixed on the soldier, standing with empty hands on their sidewalk. After what felt like a full minute, the the first voice spoke again. "Walk forward, slowly. Keep your hands where we can see them." Flint complied, stepping past his weapons and approaching the gap in the barricade with his palms raised. Mandy walked beside him, her rifle now slung over her shoulder to appear less threatening. As they reached the line of trucks, several armed men moved in from both sides, forming a loose circle around them. A heavy-set man in a hunting vest stepped forward from the group. He had a pump-action shotgun resting in the crook of his arm and a look on his face that fell somewhere between suspicion and contempt. "You've got your 5 minutes," the man said. "Make them count." "You brought sick people into this building," Flint said, getting straight to the point. "The ambulance that just came through, the person on that stretcher, they have the same thing that's turning people into those creatures out there." The man's expression didn't change. A few of the others shifted uncomfortably, but nobody spoke. "I don't know how many people you've got inside who are showing flu symptoms, but every single one of them is going to get worse. And when they die from it, they're going to come back as one of those things. Not in a few days, within seconds of dying." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," the heavy-set man said. "I've watched it happen with my own eyes," Flint replied. "Multiple times. And I'm telling you that if you don't separate the sick from the healthy right now, people in that building are going to start dying and turning, and you won't be able to stop it once it starts." "He's telling the truth," Mandy said, stepping forward. "I was at the grocery store when those things attacked. They're not sick people. They're dead people that got back up, and they will kill everyone in that school if you don't listen." The heavy-set man looked at Mandy, then back at Flint. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed like the message might be getting through. Then one of the men behind him stepped forward, a younger man with a ball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Christopher told us not to trust anything the military says," the younger man said. "This is probably some trick to get inside and finish what they started." A ripple of agreement passed through the group, heads nodding and voices murmuring in support. The brief window of receptivity slammed shut as quickly as it had opened. "This isn't a trick," Flint said, keeping his voice measured despite the frustration building in his chest. "I put my weapons down and walked up here alone because there wasn't time to do anything else. The only thing I'm trying to do is keep the people inside that building alive." "And we're supposed to just take your word for it," the heavy-set man said. Before Flint could respond, 2 of the armed men moved in from behind and grabbed him by the arms. A third pulled his radio off his belt and tossed it to the man in the hunting vest. Flint didn't resist, knowing that fighting back would only confirm every suspicion they had about him. "Mandy, tell them," Flint said as they pulled his arms behind his back. "You need to listen to him," Mandy shouted at the group. "I've seen what happens. I've been out there all night. If you don't move those sick people away from everyone else, you're going to have a massacre on your hands." "Mandy, go home," the heavy-set man said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "You've had a rough night and you're not thinking straight." "I'm thinking straighter than any of you," she shot back, her voice rising. "You're all standing out here playing soldier while people are dying inside that building, and none of you have the first clue about what's actually happening." Her words bounced off the group like stones off armor. A couple of the men exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody moved to intervene as the 2 holding Flint began marching him toward the school's front entrance. The heavy-set man turned to one of the younger sentries and jerked his thumb toward Mandy. "Walk her to the road and make sure she gets home safe," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," Mandy protested. "It's not a request," the man replied without looking back. Flint caught Mandy's eye as he was led away. He gave her a subtle shake of his head, telling her not to push it any further. Getting herself arrested or worse wouldn't help either of them. She needed to be on the outside, where she could still make a difference. Mandy stared at him for a long moment, her fists clenched at her sides and her jaw set tight. She looked like she was about to charge through the group and start swinging, but she caught the warning in Flint's expression and forced herself to stay put. The last thing Flint saw before being dragged through the school's front doors was Mandy turning to walk back toward the road, the young sentry trailing behind her. Her shoulders were rigid with anger, and she didn't look back. Chapter 3. The 2 men marched Flint through the front doors and into the main hallway of the school. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a flat, sterile glow across the linoleum floor, and the air carried the stale smell of industrial cleaning products mixed with something worse: sweat, fear, and the faint undercurrent of sickness. The hallway was crowded. Families had set up makeshift camps along both walls, sitting on blankets and sleeping bags with their belongings piled around them. Children sat with their knees pulled to their chests, watching the soldier being escorted past them with wide, unblinking eyes. A few of the adults stood up as Flint was led by, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Flint kept his mouth shut and his eyes forward, taking in as much information as he could without turning his head. He counted doorways, noted which rooms had people in them and which appeared to be empty, and tracked the exits he could see at either end of the hall. If things went bad, and he was becoming more certain by the minute that they would, he needed to know the layout. They passed the school's main office where a cluster of men and women were huddled around a desk covered with maps and papers. A CB radio sat on the corner of the desk, its red power light glowing steadily. One of the men inside looked up and locked eyes with Flint as he was led past, but said nothing. The escorts turned him down a side corridor that led away from the main gathering areas. The crowd thinned out here, replaced by closed classroom doors with small rectangular windows set into them. Most of the rooms were dark, but light spilled out from under a door near the end of the hall. One of the men pulled a set of keys from his pocket and unlocked the door, shoving it open with his shoulder. The room beyond was a standard classroom, desks pushed to the walls, and a whiteboard at the front that still had math equations written across it in blue marker. The overhead lights were on, buzzing faintly with the hum of aging ballasts. Two people lay on thin mattresses that had been placed on the floor near the windows. Both were covered in blankets despite the warmth of the room, and both were in bad shape. The nearer one was a woman in her 40s, her hair matted with sweat against her forehead. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that filled the quiet room with an unsettling rhythm. A bucket sat beside her mattress, the contents of which Flint could smell from the doorway. The second person was a man, younger, maybe late 20s. He was curled on his side with his back to the door, trembling under his blanket despite the sheen of sweat visible on the back of his neck. A low, continuous moan escaped his lips with each exhale, the kind of sound that came from someone who had moved past the point of being able to articulate their suffering. Flint's stomach tightened as he looked at them. He had seen this before. These people were deep into the infection, and based on the severity of their symptoms, they didn't have long. "Sit down," one of the escorts ordered, pointing to a wooden chair that had been placed in the center of the room, facing the door. Flint complied, lowering himself into the chair without resistance. The wood creaked under his weight as he settled in. One of the men produced a pair of handcuffs and secured Flint's right wrist to the arm of the chair. The metal bit into his skin as the man ratcheted it tight, the click of the mechanism echoing in the quiet classroom. Flint tested the restraint with a subtle tug. The chair was solid but old, the kind of heavy wooden furniture that schools had been using for decades. The arm it was attached to had some give to it, but breaking free would take time and effort, neither of which he would have if the situation deteriorated the way he expected it to. "You're putting me in a room with sick people," Flint said, looking up at the two escorts. "You understand what's going to happen when they die, right?" Neither man responded. They exchanged a brief glance, something passing between them that might have been doubt, but it was gone before it could take root. The taller one jerked his chin toward the door, and both of them stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind them. The lock clicked into place a moment later. Flint sat in the silence, listening to the labored breathing of the two sick people and the muffled sounds of the school filtering through the walls. Footsteps in the hallway, distant voices, the occasional cry of a child. The normal sounds of a community under stress, completely unaware of the horror that was incubating in rooms just like this one throughout the building. He looked around the classroom, cataloging everything within reach. The desks pushed against the walls were lightweight, plastic and metal combinations that wouldn't be useful for much. A few textbooks sat stacked on a shelf near the whiteboard. A pencil cup on the teacher's desk held an assortment of pens and markers. Nothing that would help him get free of the handcuffs or defend himself against what was coming. His cleaver was gone, left on the sidewalk outside. His rifle, too. His radio had been confiscated at the barricade. He was handcuffed to a chair in a locked room with two people who were going to die and reanimate, and nobody outside this door believed a word of what he had told them. Several minutes passed before the lock clicked again, and the door swung open. The man who stepped through was different from the escorts. He was older, mid-50s, with a weathered face and the build of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. His jeans were tucked into worn cowboy boots, and a denim jacket hung open over a plaid shirt. He had a revolver holstered on his hip, and the demeanor of a man who was accustomed to being in charge of whatever room he walked into. Two men followed him in, taking positions on either side of the door with their arms crossed. They were younger and bigger, and they watched Flint with the flat stares of men who had been told to keep quiet and look intimidating. The older man pulled a student desk away from the wall and turned it to face Flint before sitting down on the edge of it. He folded his arms across his chest and studied the sergeant with an unhurried gaze, as if he had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. "I'm Christopher," the man said. "I run things around here." "Sergeant Flint," Flint replied, "and with respect, you're running things right into the ground." Christopher's mouth twitched, though it was hard to tell if it was amusement or irritation. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "You've got some nerve, I'll give you that. Your people come into my town uninvited, start pulling folks out of their homes without so much as an explanation. And now you're sitting in my chair telling me I'm the problem." "Your people ambushed my soldiers in a parking lot," Flint replied. "The ones who came here to help evacuate the sick before they turned into those things out there." "Help," Christopher repeated, letting the word hang in the air as if testing its weight. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looked a lot more like a government operation to round up civilians and haul them off to God knows where. They were collecting people with A-type blood because those people are infected with a virus that's going to kill them," Flint said. "And when it does, they come back. You've seen the creatures out there. That's where they come from." Christopher stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He glanced over his shoulder at the two sick people on the mattresses, then back to Flint. "I've seen a lot of things in the last couple of days that I can't explain," Christopher said. "People getting violent, attacking their neighbors, acting like animals. But a virus that kills people and brings them back from the dead? That sounds like something the government cooked up in a lab, not something that just happens." "I don't know where it came from," Flint said. "That's above my pay grade. What I do know is that those two people behind me are going to die, and when they do, they're going to get back up and attack anyone within reach, and there's nothing you or I can do to stop it." "According to you," Christopher said, "according to what I've seen with my own eyes, in 3 different cities over the last several days. This isn't something I heard on the radio or read in a briefing. I've watched people die and come back. I've had to put them down myself. And I'm telling you right now that every sick person in this building is a threat to everyone around them." Christopher was quiet for a stretch, his mind working slowly as he processed what Flint had said. The two men by the door shifted their weight, but kept their mouths shut. From behind Flint, the woman on the mattress let out a long, rattling cough that dissolved into a wet, choking sound before she settled back into her shallow breathing. "You know what I think?" Christopher said, straightening up on the desk. "I think the government released something, some kind of bioweapon or experiment gone wrong, and now they're scrambling to cover it up, sending soldiers into small towns to grab the evidence before anyone figures out what happened. And when folks like me push back, they send more soldiers to finish the job." "That's not what's happening here," Flint said. "Maybe, maybe not," Christopher replied. "But I've got a building full of people who are scared out of their minds, and the only thing keeping them from tearing each other apart is the fact that they trust me to figure this out. So I'm going to take my time and get to the bottom of it." He stood up from the desk and adjusted the revolver on his hip, looking down at Flint with an expression that had settled into something resembling cold patience. "I'll give you a while to sit here and think about what you want to tell me when I come back," Christopher said. "And maybe the truth this time, instead of this zombie fairy tale." "You're making a mistake," Flint said. "Every minute you waste is a minute closer to those people turning." "If that's true, then I guess you'll be the first to know," Christopher replied, glancing at the 2 sick figures on the floor. "Something to keep you company while you think." Christopher turned and walked out of the room without another word. His 2 men followed, and the door swung shut behind them. The lock clicked, and Flint was alone again, with the sound of labored breathing and the buzz of the fluorescent lights above. Flint pulled against the handcuff, twisting his wrist to test the connection to the chair arm. The wood groaned slightly under the pressure, but held. He could break it if he had enough time and leverage, but it wouldn't be quick or quiet, and the noise would bring the guards back before he could finish. He leaned back in the chair and focused on the two patients behind him, listening to their breathing. The woman's had grown more erratic since Christopher left, each inhale a strained effort that seemed to take longer to come than the last. The man had gone quiet, his trembling having subsided into a stillness that was somehow more unsettling than the shaking had been. Flint closed his eyes and counted the seconds between the woman's breaths. 12 seconds. 15. 20. Each gap stretched longer than the one before it, the silence between them growing heavier with implication. Then the gap didn't end. Flint's eyes opened. The room was quiet. The woman's breathing had stopped entirely, leaving only the low hum of the lights and the distant murmur of the school beyond the walls. He turned his head as far as he could, craning his neck to look over his shoulder at the mattresses. The woman was motionless, her chest no longer rising and falling. Her face was turned toward the ceiling, eyes half open and mouth slack. The grayish color of her skin had deepened, taking on a waxy quality that removed any doubt about what had just happened. Flint's pulse spiked. He pulled hard against the handcuff, the metal cutting into his wrist as the chair arm creaked under the strain. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on, come on." The woman's fingers twitched. It was subtle at first, just a slight curling of the digits that could have been mistaken for a posthumous muscle spasm. But then her hand clenched into a fist, and her head rolled to the side, her half-open eyes now staring at the man on the mattress beside her. The dead woman sat up with a speed that defied the condition her body had been in moments before. Her movements were sharp and sudden, the lethargy of illness replaced by something driven and predatory. A low moan escaped her throat as she turned toward the man beside her, who was still lying on his side with his eyes closed, oblivious to what was happening next to him. She lunged. Her hands grabbed the man's shoulder and pulled him onto his back, and before he could react, her teeth sank into the side of his neck. His eyes flew open and a scream tore from his throat, his arms flailing uselessly as the creature pinned him down and ripped a chunk of flesh free. Blood sprayed across the mattress and the classroom floor as the man thrashed beneath the zombie's weight. His screams turned to gurgling chokes as the wound in his neck pumped crimson across the white linoleum. Flint threw his weight against the chair arm, the wood splintering slightly but refusing to give way. He pulled again, harder, feeling the grain begin to separate under the mounting pressure. The man on the mattress went still. The creature raised its head from the wound, blood dripping from its chin as it scanned the room with vacant eyes. Its gaze swept past the desks, past the whiteboard, and settled on the sergeant handcuffed to the chair in the center of the room.